I'm Robert MacNeil. The latest facts and full analysis of the arrests in the New York Trade Center bombing, the president's Bosnia policy, and the week's politics with Gergen and Shields, tonight on the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour.
Good evening. I'm Jim Lehrer in Washington.
And I'm Robert MacNeil in New York. After the news summary this Friday, we look closely at the arrests in the World Trade Center bombing with the top FBI official in New York and experts on terrorism. Then we hear President Clinton's assessment of the U.S. airdrops in Bosnia, and our analysts David Gergen and Mark Shields discuss the week's politics.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour has been provided by PepsiCo. PepsiCo. Part of helping the world live and communicate better is keeping it well informed. That's why funding for the NewsHour is also provided by AT&T and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and viewers like you.
There were 4 more arrests possibly connected with the World Trade Center bombing today. An FBI spokesman said only that they were 4 men and they were arrested in Brooklyn. He said they would not be arraigned today. That brings to 6 the number of people who have been arrested or charged in the ever-widening case. Earlier today, a man identified as Ibrahim El-Gabrowni was arrested for obstruction of justice. El-Gabrowni was held without bail after agents found a gun and ammunition in his Brooklyn apartment. He's said to have ties with Mohamed Salame, a New Jersey man who was charged yesterday in the bombing. A federal investigator said some key people linked to Salame have disappeared and may have fled the United States. This afternoon, camera crews were allowed into the Trade Towers garage where the bomb exploded. Access to the area has been restricted because it was considered structurally unsafe. Support beams have been placed near the bomb site so investigators could search for evidence. We'll have a lot more on the story right after the news summary. Jim?
Cult leader David Koresh allowed one more child to leave the armed compound near Waco, Texas today. He told negotiators he and his followers were not planning a mass suicide like the Jonestown massacre in 1978. The confrontation began Sunday when federal agents attempted a weapons raid on the complex. 4 agents and at least 10 cult followers were killed in the gun battle that followed. The April summit between Presidents Clinton and Yeltsin will be in Vancouver, Canada. Mr. Clinton announced the location today and said he plans to present new ideas to support democracy in Russia. He said Russia had made enough progress toward economic reform for the United States to offer further help. He was asked if that meant more financial aid.
Obviously, money will be discussed, but it's not just a question of money, and it's certainly not money alone. I don't want to put a figure on it yet. We've made no decisions, but I can tell you we've discussed some rather innovative things that have not yet been on the table in these discussions in the past. This will not be a meet and greet meeting with President Yeltsin. We have met before, and we have talked several times since I have been in office. I'm going there to try to have a very business-like meeting, and as we get closer to the meeting, we'll be able to discuss more specifics.
Mr. Clinton also said he wanted to tighten sanctions on Serbia. He said he was talking with U.S. allies about other ways to end the war in Bosnia. The president disputed charges the U.S. humanitarian airdrop had provoked a new Serb offensive. He said he didn't believe the drops had exposed Muslims to any extra danger. Those airdrops continued today, as did UN efforts to evacuate Muslims wounded in the fighting. We have a report narrated by Louise Bates of Worldwide Television News.
The Frankfurt-based airdrop operation goes on. 5 missions in 5 days. For safety reasons, the aircraft fly at night at up to 17,000 feet to avoid hostile ground fire. There's no guarantee that the packages of medical supplies and ready-to-eat meals reach their intended target, Bosnian Muslim towns besieged by Serbs. But with nearly 25 tons of aid parachuted down in the latest mission, it's hoped that much of it does get through. On the ground, an aid convoy heading for the Muslim enclaves in eastern Bosnia has been held up just inside Serbia. This despite assurances by Bosnian Serbs that they would allow a humanitarian corridor to the besieged area for a two-way flow of aid and refugees. Urgency is added to their mission by reports of continued Serbian shelling. UN officials have been denied access to parts of eastern Bosnia for the past 10 months. They fear that if they cannot get through soon, it may be too late.
That's our summary of the news. Now it's on to the World Trade Center bombing arrests with the FBI view and the thoughts of 4 terrorism experts. The president's Bosnia policy, and David Gergen and Mark Shields analyze the politics of the week. The arrests in the New York World Trade Center bombing are our lead tonight. This afternoon, an FBI spokesman said 4 more people have been arrested today, possibly in connection with what prosecutors are calling the single most destructive act of terrorism on American soil. The blast a week ago today left 5 dead and 1,000 injured. Today's arrests were made in Brooklyn, New York. Another man was arraigned today in federal court. Ibrahim El-Gabrowni was charged with obstruction of justice. The 25-year-old suspect is alleged to have hit government agents who came to search his Brooklyn apartment. The apartment was listed as the address for Mohamed Salameh, the man who rented the van believed to have carried the bomb. Salameh and El-Gabrowni are said to be Muslim fundamentalists who follow a radical Egyptian cleric living in New Jersey. For more detail on today's arrests and the investigation, we hear from James Fox, the New York FBI director. Mr. Fox, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
What can you tell us about the 4 more men arrested today?
4 individuals were arrested late this afternoon near a Muslim mosque in Brooklyn. They were charged with interstate transportation of a stolen motor vehicle. They stole a car at Logan Airport in Boston and drove it to the mosque. They entered the mosque, and when they came back to the car, they were placed under arrest.
Why won't you say that this is, you told me before we went on, this is possibly in connection. Why won't you say that it's in connection with the bombing?
Actually, we haven't made that link yet. We don't have sufficient evidence at this point to say it is connected with the bombing. It's just a possibility.
I see. The man arraigned today, Ibrahim El-Gabrowni, is said to be a suspect in the bombing. What makes him a suspect?
Gabrowni may be considered a suspect in the bombing simply because he was an associate of the individual arrested and arraigned yesterday, Mohamed Salameh. Because of the conditions of the arrest, he was exiting premises we were about to search. As we came in, he behaved in a nervous manner. We attempted to stop him and discuss what he was doing there, and he immediately became somewhat violent, resisting arrest, and indeed finally throwing a punch at one of the arresting officers. Material was found on his person which further incriminated him, indicating a possible connection at this point.
What was found on him?
We aren't detailing that at this point.
I've read that what was found on him were fake Nicaraguan passports for the El Said Noser, the man who was acquitted of murdering Rabbi Kahane in New York, but convicted on weapons charges and is now serving 22 years in Attica. Can you confirm that? I mean,
the passports were found. We only speculate among ourselves what he intended to do with the passports and what...
He's a cousin of Nasser.
Yes, he is a relative, and what role, if any, he may have had as a co-conspirator in the bombing.
I see. Describe his behavior. I read that after he was arrested, he asked if he could wash his hands, and then, well, describe what he did.
Again, we're getting into issues that weren't raised at the arraignment, and under federal regulations, we can't discuss if they may be evidentiary in nature.
I read them in the complaint that was issued by the FBI.
You have described action which would indicate perhaps he was concerned with a residue that might have been left on his hand.
According to the complaint, he plunged his hands into a toilet bowl which had urine in it, which would suggest what?
To me, and I think to any layman, it might suggest that he was attempting to remove any incriminating residue that might have been on his hands.
A federal official told the Associated Press, we quoted it in our news summary, that some key people linked to Salameh have disappeared. Is that true?
There are individuals that were associates of Mohamed Salameh that we would like to talk to, and at this point we're just seeking them for purposes of interview. We clearly are not terming them suspects. However, some of these individuals disappeared shortly after the blast, and we are unable to locate them at this time.
Were you forced by the publication of the rental van discovery to arrest Salome before you intended to?
Let me say in general, in complex investigations, whether it's a terrorist investigation or an organized crime investigation, if we can take time developing the investigation, get court-ordered wiretaps, microphone surveillance, physical surveillance, in those circumstances where we can take all the time we need, we can often find out all about an individual, what his activities are, who his associates are, and that's clearly what we would have preferred to do in the case of Salome.
Did the same report tip off his associates to disappear?
We frankly don't know. It did not tip off Salome, obviously, because hours after the newspaper was published, he appeared at the rental agency to reclaim his deposit.
To be fair to the newspaper, Newsday of Long Island, the editor says the FBI and the police knew Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. what they were going to publish and raised no objection to it.
I'll tell you frankly, we had some long discussions late into the night on that issue. Wednesday night, a lot of things were breaking in this case, including the Newsday publication. It was my feeling, and I made the final decision not to intercede with Newsday, it was my feeling that enough newspapers, TV stations, and reporters were beginning to get wind of the fact that we had traced the van to the rental agency, that to ask Newsday to stop publication would be unfair, because I felt perhaps so many other media agencies and newspapers would publish, and we couldn't ask all 4 newspapers and 6 TV stations to hold back.
It's reported today that more search warrants were executed in New Jersey. What are they for?
More search warrants were executed and have not been returned fully at this time, but in general, without disclosing the locations, I can say that additional ingredients used in manufacturing bombs are being discovered.
What's the next step for you?
Well, of course, from the beginning, we've desperately wanted to get down to the crater of the explosion, the seat of the explosion. We know that there will be additional valuable evidence and information when we get there. However, that is not as critical as it was a few days ago. One of the reasons for getting into the crater would be to discover the vehicle used, the nature of the explosive, and we will still discover that when we get there. But we have discovered the vehicle and the person who rented it, so that at least we know. In addition, just getting down to the base residue will tell us so much. We will comb through this rubble virtually with a fine sifter, and as one of our bomb experts puts it, federal and local law enforcement will touch every grain of sand in that explosion.
It was reported that you believed that the vehicle, the one that Salome rented, blew up on the ramp after going over a traffic bump. Does that mean you think it blew up accidentally before they intended to explode it?
I think that theory is speculation by several newspapers, and we have not participated in that speculation at all. We have no indication that it blew up as it hit a traffic bump.
I see. Can you confirm that the driver of the van was killed in the explosion, as has been reported?
No, we can't confirm that. One more thing we will find as we get down to the seat of the explosion is anyone who suffered a mishap in the course of the bombing.
How important a player is Salome?
We don't really know at this time. He's clearly a principal in the bombing conspiracy. There are many puzzling things about Salome, not the least of which is why he went back to the rental agency and to the police department so many times thinking he was following procedure to get back $400 after accomplishing this major act of terrorism and violence. $400 should seem to be irrelevant. We really haven't worked that part of it out.
His attorney says that to believe your allegations are true presupposes an individual begging to be caught.
Well, it certainly is illogical behavior on the part of Salome. However, I think with the evidence that we've produced just in the complaint, it's pretty clear that he was connected, and when we examine and produce the additional evidence obtained in those searches today, I think it'll be crystal clear.
Did you use the words aid and abet in the complaint because you don't think he's a principal perpetrator?
I wouldn't say, I wouldn't disclose our entire thinking and theory as to why we use those words. Those words were used by the United States Attorney's Office. At the point we filed the complaint, we knew that he was at least assisting in the bombing of the World Trade Center.
Does Salome's apparent role add up to you at the moment as an experienced investigator, or is there some big psychological hole in it?
I can't say it adds up to me in all respects, but in most major cases, when the case begins to break for us, and this one moved very quickly when it broke Wednesday night, sometimes it's weeks before or months before we really figure out what relevance that particular aspect of the case was.
The media keeps saying, and we keep repeating it too, that Salome is linked to a Muslim fundamentalist group led by Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind cleric in New Jersey. How is it linked? Is he linked other than that they attend the same mosque?
I think the media has confirmed really beyond a reasonable doubt that they attended the mosque, that he associated with other Muslim fundamentalists. The FBI has not stated he is linked to a terrorist movement at any time, and we aren't ready to make that statement at this time.
Is it true that the FBI, you knew of Salome because of anti-terrorist activities of the FBI in the United States?
I should say in general, since 1972, the FBI has been building a terrorism intelligence base that is collecting data about terrorist activities around the world. Salome has come to our attention in the past, as have literally thousands of other individuals. Now, the fact that his name may be in our intelligence base in itself doesn't mean that much. When we put it together with the facts that were disclosed in the investigation of the bombing, it means a lot.
Mm-hmm. He wasn't under surveillance currently?
He was not under surveillance, no.
Uh-huh. Would you describe how the vehicle identification number system worked? As I understand it, first of all, the part of the car that you found had only part of the number on it. Would you describe what happened?
That's right. The vehicle identification number on automobiles is in various locations on the car. In this particular instance, it was on the frame, a very sturdy part of the car manufacturer. It was only a partial number. However, providing this partial number to the National Auto Theft Bureau and having them go through their records always amazes me, because they often come back with literally volumes of information about the vehicle that number was part of. And in this case, they came back with not only the vehicle, but the fact that it had been reported stolen in Jersey City the evening of the bombing.
Reported by Salome himself.
By Salome.
Uh-huh. If Salome had not returned for his refund, would you have been able to trace him anyway because the address he gave when he rented the vehicle?
That's always just guessing if we would have been able to find him. We certainly realized he was a key player, and he was the first big break we had in this major investigation. So we would have really unleashed all of our resources in an effort to find him. If he hadn't fled the country, I believe we would have found him.
What is the big question that's still unanswered in your mind?
The big question is, who were the co-conspirators, if any, and what was their motivation? And we really aren't prepared to speculate on either of those at this time.
Well, Mr. Fox, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Jim?
This story has been unfolding quickly. Correspondent Tom Bearden has this backgrounder on the main suspect and the investigation.
Mohamed Salome lived in this apartment building on a quiet residential street in Jersey City, New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan. Salome is a Jordanian citizen who entered the U.S. in 1988 on a tourist visa and remained illegally. From the apartment house, it's only a short walk to the El Salam Mosque, where Salome was part of a congregation that included other people allegedly connected to terrorism. The mosque is actually the top floor of a commercial building in the downtown area. It was open for prayer services at noon today, but worshipers weren't interested in talking to reporters.
Your effort is useless, and I'm telling you kindly, please leave the place now.
Merchants in the shops surrounding the mosque say most of the people who go there are neighborhood residents, that the only problems it causes are occasional brief traffic jams when people arrive to worship.
It's very quiet. You know, it's something that nobody notices anymore because it happens every day. The worst thing that was happening was they tie up traffic when they come downstairs, waiting for the men and children to come down.
However, another member of the congregation, El Said Noser, was tried for the killing of Jewish activist and Rabbi Meir Kahane in 1990. He was acquitted of the slaying, but is serving time on related weapons charges. The mosque's spiritual leader, Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, was also linked to the Kahane murder. The bombing suspect is said to be a devout follower of Rahman. 12 years ago, Rahman was charged with sanctioning the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. He was tried but acquitted. Afterward, Rahman came to the U.S., entering a self-imposed exile. The U.S. government has been seeking to deport him for some time. Rahman still preaches violence against the Egyptian and U.S. governments. However, through his lawyer today, the sheikh denied any involvement in the Trade Center bombing and condemned it. Meanwhile, police authorities continue the painstaking investigation of the wreckage under the World Trade Center. Investigators identified the van through vehicle identification numbers on some of the twisted fragments of metal recovered from the rubble, even though their access to the blast site was limited for most of the week. That's because the bomb, placed several levels below ground, caused enough structural damage to make it unsafe for officials to go poking through the rubble. The columns which held up the Vista Hotel survived, but the blast caused a safety problem when it tore away the concrete floors between them. Normally, the concrete floor of the parking garage serves as lateral support. Authorities first evacuated the hotel to lighten the weight on the columns, then holes were cut in the hotel floor and steel beams lowered into the crater. 18 of them were welded into place to keep the columns from moving sideways. With structural integrity restored, investigators will be able to examine the tons of wreckage still at the bottom of the garage. Although authorities feel they have located the vehicle that was the source of the blast, they say much work remains to be done.
Now, for further perspectives on the investigation and the arrests so far, Peter FLORY was the Associate Coordinator of the Office of Counterterrorism at the State Department. MOHAMED HAKKI is an Egyptian journalist, former spokesman for Egyptian President Mubarak. Neil Livingstone has written extensively about terrorism and is the author of the forthcoming book, Inside Militant Islam. Robert FRIEDMAN is a writer for The Village Voice in New York City and has covered Middle East groups in the New York area. Mr. Friedman, beginning with you, assuming just for discussion purposes that there is a serious connection between Salameh and Sheikh Rahman, what would be his motivation for wanting his followers to bomb the World Trade Center?
Well, I think his motivation would be that he expresses the desire to overthrow the government of Egypt and to use any means necessary. At the same time, the United States is the great Satan. And any act that tears at the fabric of American society, that shows our allies in the Arab world that we, the United States, is not invulnerable, even though we're the world's only remaining superpower, furthers his cause and the cause of his followers. So it's to sow disruption and discord here in the United States.
Mr. HAKKI, do Egyptian authorities believe that the Sheikh is a leader of a terrorist group or a man who preaches it and then lets the chips fall where they may? If people want to get together and go do it, that's their business, but he doesn't direct them.
What I can tell you is that he raises more questions in Egyptian minds and the way the United States is treating the whole thing than really give any answers. For instance,
just mean the fact that he's here in the United States?
He's not only here. He gets a tourist visa from Khartoum. Tell me about it. And then he gets, the next sentence in the story says, on his green card was revoked last year. And I said, come on, what green card? He was on the terrorist list. So how come?
Meaning that on the terrorist list, he shouldn't have been given a tourist visa in the first place, and then he shouldn't have been admitted. But somehow, so the explanation is that everybody along the way made a mistake. They didn't catch his name because he was in there 4 or 5
But the other mistake also that we see is that you make something of him like Imam Khomeini. I mean, there's a world of difference between someone like Omar Abdurrahman and Khomeini. I mean,
what is the difference?
Khomeini has, he's changed the course of history. He overthrew the Shah of Iran. He changed, the whole. He has following. He's a faqih. Whereas Omar Abdurrahman you know, if you listen to what he's saying, he almost strikes you as someone who is illiterate about Islam. How can he be considered as Imam or a Khomeini? He does have followers, yes, but these are kids who are, you know, in the depth of desperation. They don't know anything about it.
Mr. Livingston, what's your reading of the potential connection between this man and what happened in New York a week ago today?
Well, of course, it's all speculation
Sure.
right now, but you have to believe that there are people involved in this conspiracy, and I do believe it is a conspiracy, much more intelligent than Salome. He appears to be the guy that couldn't shoot straight. We may have found the dumbest terrorist in the world, but it's not implausible to think that people came here from outside our borders, assembled the vast amount of explosive that was required, and without anyone missing it, got the vehicle, built the bomb, and so on. And that at that point they needed some local help. They needed someone who knew their way around town, who had a driver's license to rent the truck and so on. So where do you go? You go to a local mosque where you know that is a center of radical activity, and you pick up a couple of local people after working there or going to services for a while, and then you skip town as soon as the blast is over, and you leave these guys here holding the bag. I would say that I don't think there is, from what I've known, organized terrorist cells in this country as part of militant Islam. There's certainly a lot of bad actors here, but they really haven't coalesced into a major movement. So I have to say that the fingerprints ultimately, at least my gut reaction suggests, will lead us someplace outside this country.
Mr. Flory, do you have a gut reaction that leads you somewhere?
Well, at this point, we obviously know a lot more than we knew 48 hours ago, but there's a great deal that we don't know. I don't know if I'd go quite so far as Neil right now. So far, what we have is arrests within this country. The FBI is appropriately being fairly reticent about the information it gives out. There could indeed be an international connection. I mean, various indicia of that are there. But right now we haven't proven that, we don't know that, and there clearly are cells of bad actors in this country. I think it's important to note that these are cells in the sense of being very small entities in a group.
Terrorist cells or just cells of people who don't like the United States or don't like Egypt or don't like fill in the blank?
When I said, I was picking up on what Neil said
Yeah.
in terms of bad actors, in other words, terrorists. But these are small groups. I mean, obviously, fundamentalism does not at all equate with terrorism. Sure. And
that's the point I was trying to make. I mean, the fact that there are people who feel very strongly about Islam does not make them a terrorist. I mean, that's
absolutely not.
Right.
And that's one of the unfortunate impressions that in situations like this sometimes comes out.
But what about Mr. Livingston's point that while there's, and even Mr. Fox just expressed it to Robin about this guy Salome, the guy who left the finger. I mean, if he hadn't done this and he hadn't done that, then he wouldn't have been in prison, and I mean, wouldn't be jailed, and all of this wouldn't have happened. But it is conceivable, is it not, to come up with a scenario where this guy didn't know anything at all about a bombing in the World Trade Center, and that he went and rented his van, and he was a tool rather than one of the conspirators. That's conceivable, is it not, in the world of terrorism?
Very conceivable. I mean, in the world of terrorism, in the world of crime, I mean, there are always dupes, there are always unfortunates who are told to do something and pick up something and leave it in a certain place on a certain day and never know what it is, and conceivably, I don't know if it's likely, but conceivably would even go back to pick up their money afterwards.
It was in the reporters who were in the courtroom last night at the arraignment said that he seemed stunned, surprised that he was being charged with this. Mr. Friedman, you've spent a lot of time with for instance, these four people. You heard what Mr. Fox said, that he wasn't prepared to say that these people were directly involved, but they were arrested near a mosque in Brooklyn. Connect that to the mosque in Jersey City where Rahman and also where Salome worshipped.
Well, I don't want to smear the mosque. There are some bad actors there. When El Sayed Nosair was arrested for the murder of Meir Kahane, that mosque and some of its worshippers were investigated. As one was El Ghabrani, the person that was arrested earlier for punching out the FBI agent. So there were a number of people around Nosair that were known to the FBI and were looked at very closely. I don't know if they served as logistics. I don't know if people slipped in and out as has been suggested. But it's surprising to me that this group that was so heavily investigated, the people around NewsHour and Rahman, were able to
NewsHour's
perpetrate
the man
this.
who's now, he's in Attica, is he not? At New York State Prison in Attica.
Yeah, he's serving 22 years for crimes related to the murder of Rabbi Meir Kahane.
Yeah. Well, now the mosque you're talking about the one in Jersey City or the one in Brooklyn where these 4 men were arrested this afternoon, or both?
Well, NewsHour and Sheikh Abdul Rahman worshipped and preached in both the Brooklyn and the New Jersey mosque.
Yeah. What do you think of Neil Livingstone's theory, or potential? I don't want to put such a strong word on it, but a possibility that some outsiders came, used these folks at these various mosques, knowing that there might be some sympathy for doing something like this, and then beat it.
Well, it makes sense in the sense that one would hope that because El Ghabrani and others that have been implicated in the bombing of the World Trade Center, because they've been investigated, because they've been fouled, because they've been surveilled, that it would be hard for them to organize such a complex act as has occurred. So it would be easier for people outside of the United States to slip in and use them in the way of gophers, drivers, logistics, in ancillary side jobs. It would be astounding to me if this group around NewsHour that was investigated and watched, I think up until the present, was able to pull this a terrorist act off, one of this incredible magnitude.
In other words, somebody from the outside had to have organized it, you think, based on your knowledge of these people?
I think so.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Mr. Livingston?
I do. You know, it's interesting. I was doing an article some months ago on militant Islam, and long before this episode, and I talked to some people in the federal government, and they said there aren't so much cells here, but architecture. In other words, there are buildings around the country, Islamic student centers and mosques, a small handful, where a variety of very radical people have coalesced and they kind of network through these buildings. They're not really organizations as such, but they really, it's a place if you want to pull off an activity, you can come and get together, maybe influence a few other people to join you. And
what kind of act? You're talking about
criminal activity.
Criminal
activity, which would be terrorist activity. And so the only really truly organized group that we have that is a militant, if you will, Islamic organization in this country may be Hamas, that group that is deeply involved today in leading the insurrection on the Israeli West Bank. They are organized and function as certainly a revolutionary, some have said a terrorist organization. The rest of these guys, they're not so easy to type.
Mr. Flory, if we had access to the kind of computers that you had when you were in the government, and we said, we typed in there, all right, give us the activity list on potential Muslim fundamentalist terrorists in this country, things they either attempted to do and got caught before it ever got off the ground, things that were thwarted at various times, or things they did get caught doing, would there be a long list?
If there is a list, I haven't seen it. Now, obviously, when people apply for visas and green cards and things, trying to come into the country, they're checked out. That doesn't always work, as we've seen in this in this case. We're not a society that goes around surveilling everybody.
Sure.
But on the other hand, if somebody is involved in an
and I'm talking about
activity that seems to be illegal,
semi-overt acts, or something that was broken up during a planning phase or something. In other words, are there little groups of Muslim fundamentalists in this country being under surveillance by the FBI and other things with the idea that they might do something, might commit acts of terrorism? Is it something that's in the wind within the organizations that are responsible for watching this sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't. That's not something I'd be able to comment on in any detail. If people are caught in suspected or even sort of initial criminal activities, then I'd say law enforcement officials would take note. But otherwise, I really.
But there's not something that there's not a lot of this been going on in the past few years.
Well, there are...
In this country now, I'm talking about the United States.
There are different kinds of activities, and a lot of this does tend to run together. These groups are primarily political and social groups, as well as religious groups. Some of them, Hamas, for example, espouse a very militant, in some ways revolutionary type of political and social thinking. But again, that obviously doesn't make them terrorists, and you, in terms of the law enforcement people, we don't watch people for what they think or for what they say. We watch it for what they do. So if people show up on the net in terms of actually committing crimes or seemingly trying to commit crimes, then I'd say that the law enforcement officials do keep an eye on them.
Mr. HAKKI, based on your special knowledge from an Egyptian point of view of Rahman and his folks, would you subscribe to the idea of Mr. Friedman and Mr. Livingstone, which is essentially that they are probably unable on their own to have committed such a terrorist act, and if they were involved as patsies or as helpers rather than as the core group that planned it?
I'll tell you why I buy that. It is a well-known fact in the Arab American community out there in Brooklyn or in New York that El Gabrouni was raising funds for the defense of Sayyid Nasir. So he must have known
this
that
is the guy who was arrested yesterday.
This is the guy who was arrested yesterday. This is Mr. Friedman was saying.
FBI agent,
So he must have been not only followed and taped and tapped or whatever it is, he must have been living in a fishbowl, under a big loop. So do you think a guy like that would, I mean, he's another dumbest guy in terrorist? I don't know. It's a bit far-fetched.
Yeah.
What
Mr. Livingstone is saying makes sense to you, that some people could have come in from the outside, used these people, and then gotten out.
This would be more, somehow more logical, more rational than a local group who meets for social reasons or whatnot would perpetrate such a heinous crime.
Yeah. Mr. Livingstone, would that explain then this kind of almost casualness with which Salmanet went about this, that he didn't realize he was part of a terrorist group, so why wouldn't he try to get his $400 back? Why wouldn't he go to the Jersey City Police? If he hadn't gone to the Jersey City Police, it wouldn't have been in that computer Mr. Fox was talking about a moment ago, and they might have found him, but it would have been a long time finding it, possibly.
Well, I think they still would have found him because they did have the VIN number of the vehicle. He gave his own driver's license with his name and so on, is my understanding, to rent the vehicle. So I think they would have gotten him. But the fact he came back 3 days in a row shows a remarkable lack of understanding or knowledge of the consequences of what had just happened. So you get the sense here, this guy is a very peripheral fellow. He didn't really understand what he was involved in. And he may have been paid to do what he did, and he felt, well, geez, they'll never catch me. Maybe if I go back in there, I can get another $400. And you'd be surprised how many large crimes or terrorist crimes have been solved because there's a weak link someplace. That was essentially how General Dozier was brought back, was they found a weak link, a drug user and so on, and one thing led to another.
Refresh my memory on General Dozier.
He was the American who was kidnapped and held hostage in Italy during the 1980s, the American general. Mm-hmm. But we've had a whole series of terrorist incidents like that there's been a minor screw-up someplace that has pointed the finger at someone eventually.
Mr. Friedman, does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does make sense. I mean, the darker scenario is that these characters, the ones that were arrested, actually did pull this off, and the surveillance wasn't as good as one would hope. And so they may have been, the terrorists that couldn't shoot straight, yet they managed to blow up a considerable hunk of New York City real estate.
And get away with it up to a point if they hadn't left their tracks. Yeah, all right.
It can go either way.
Sure. Well, gentlemen, thank you all four very much.